There's a phase on a spiritual path that comes up pretty often, the detachment from what Pierreandgerald called the character. So to put a definition on what the character is, you could say that it's the entirety of forms and objects related to what we think we are. So the character isn't limited to the physical body, it's also all the mental forms, emotions which we take as our own, for instance, or even some energetic movements or states, etc. Everything that we take as our own, that's the character. And comes a moment where naturally a stepping back occurs. I once said for fun that realizing the self is happening backwards, which isn't entirely wrong. It's a bit like that. You'll start observing the mechanisms, how it works, so that you're not bound to it anymore. Because if you don't see them, you're going to fall for it every time. You're going to get fooled without realizing it. Actually, I hear sometimes people tell me, when I went through that thing, I could see myself fall into the ego trap. But really, if you say that, that actually means that you haven't fallen for it, because you've started noticing the mechanisms of the ego, which means that you're starting to break out from it. When you start noticing the ego intervening, that means that you start liberating yourself from it. And it's quite natural while on the spiritual path to see people start thinking, "Oh, I'm such a horrible person to think the way I do. I have such bad thinking patterns." But the truth is, you've always had them, but you were not aware of it. So it is important to go through this phase, and indeed, sometimes during that phase, the detachment is so pronounced that you actually feel like you are depersonalizing yourself, which is the case. You break out from the character. Some people even tell me, I feel like I'm dehumanizing myself, and that's the case in a certain way. Indeed, you are breaking out from human identification. Those kind of experiences can happen. And what's sometimes a bit challenging is there's a phase where you're in a kind of a in-between phase, which can be uncomfortable because you're detaching yourself from humanness, but at the same time, you're not yet tasting joy, love, wholeness of being. So this phase you're in could appear as dull. Well, people do tell me that it's dull, it's savorless, that it's a bit lifeless, as if it was a non-life. And almost every spiritual seekers go through that. Gerald and I went through it, this phase. You could call it the point of dullness, but it doesn't last. Comes a moment where we realize there is a life beyond forms. There's a life beyond what we believe to be, and this life is that which observes. So by observing the character, or even by embracing everything that's coming up about the character, all the emotions, etc., we end up realizing that which embraces, and that, well, sages spell it with a capital letter because they often call absolute consciousness that. And we end up realizing that which has never changed, the very source of the experience, which can never be removed, which doesn't evolve, doesn't fluctuate, etc., and that is completely free. Once that is realized, we know we can't lose anything. And because we know we can't lose anything, then there's no more underlying human stress like the ego can make you believe that you can die, that you can lose this or that, this thing or that thing. But it doesn't matter actually, because what you are fundamentally, sages call it blissfulness. So what you are is blissfulness. So even if you were to lose everything in the manifestation, you don't lose blissfulness. So you are perpetually whole. So there can't be any suffering, really. Reason why we say that realization of the self is the end of suffering. That's how we call it. Exactly. And it's not the character, which is, like Pierre said, an amalgam of a large range of objects who can realize that, what he's just described. That's not possible. The character can only apprehend the other objects. He's not able to observe what he is in depth. It seems like it's happening through him, and obviously the character does have its importance within what I would call the experience of inner revelation, or rather the reminding of what we are, but he's not the one being conscious of it. The character can't be conscious of anything. He's a support. But still he's important because it will go through the object that he is, because that's where the emergence of what we are can take place. And indeed, observation, well, we say observation, we say look at or see, those are just terms and words, because the truth is, consciousness doesn't have an eye or anything like that. There's no seeing. It is, simply. But sometimes we believe, we think that we are not able to be. So we go through all sorts of experiences, all sorts of beliefs, paths, challenges, whatever. But the truth is, we are, even when we believe we're not. What I mean by that is, by being what we are, absolute consciousness, we actually don't go through the act of observation or seeing. Those are terms that we put. It's important that people understand that clearly. We put words on things so that we can hear and understand each other, but things go further than that. Reason why it's hard to explain it. But still, this character, within that system of incarnations and revelation of what we are, seems to have apparently a certain importance. That's how it goes. Could be otherwise, but looks like consciousness decided so. Well, not really, because it doesn't decide anything. Here, on Earth, this is how it works for revelation to happen. Well, rather the reminding, the remembering of what we are. We shall buy a decoding box. The path is filled with paradoxes. It's by observing the character object that we realize we're not the character. It's paradoxical, but that's how it is. And we also realize that actually it isn't actually an act of observation, truth be told, but we have to use words, otherwise that'd be a bit tricky to decode. Pierre is right on point, but at the same time, and that's the reason why he talks about paradox, at the same time there's nothing to observe since we already are. So that's that. So we follow the thread backwards. And I'm not kidding. Let's say that we observe the character, then we realize that which observes. And we may sometimes notice that even this is grasped, so we observe that which observes, then we observe that which observes, etc. It's like taking successive step backs. Yeah, and Ramanamaharshi said, you're perpetually prior, up until the point where all that's left is embracingness. It's not a place, it's not localized, but we've always been, quote unquote, there, meaning that we've always been that which underlies everything, that which is prior to all forms. But before all that, there's no other before. It is. For that, you really have to. We could maybe ask ourselves the question, what is that which allows me to observe and experiment that experience, etc.? And what? We're circling back to consciousness, really, inevitably. There's something that, if it's removed from the experience, it prevents us from experimenting anything. And that's the one thing we need to realize, the very foundation of experience. Yeah, it's important to mention it. What is truly the essence of what we are? Well, some traditional paths invite us to question the essence of what we are by removing that which we are not, everything that is perceived. We are not. If we remove all that is perceived, what's left about us, fundamentally? If there wasn't, actually, let's try and put all this into perspective, even if it's always in the absolute. So it looks like we have 5 senses, subtle senses, that we perceive certain things, many planes and other dimensions, lots of experiences, etc. And to be able to verbalize it, express it, share it, feel things, apprehend them, necessarily there has to be something. I say something, but really we can't define it, that underlies it all, and which is precisely not in any kind of questioning mode. It's not wandering, it doesn't move, doesn't change, has no beginning nor end, etc. So, I mean, what I'm expressing right now, without consciousness, nothing's expressible. We can't do anything. What's underlying it all is absolute consciousness. So we shall try and keep going back to that always. Always. It may seem complex, but for the visible, the manifested to be enabled, there's inevitably the invisible and unmanifested, so to speak. Otherwise, this couldn't be apprehended. So there is something prior to all that. That's how it is. There's something prior. Well, something is just a word. It's not a thing.